Hello, everyone. Welcome to the beginning of Lesson 2 or Unit 2 on the Greek world. Um, because we missed a holiday for Martin Luther King Jr. holiday, and because we need to make sure we keep going at the same pace, we have to do some of these online. I apologize. I know I talk kind of slow and it's not especially entertaining, but we'll go through about 15 slides on the Greek world um, here on this video, and then I'll finish the Greek world in person next Monday. I also apologize for getting this to you a little late. I thought I had this already on my computer, and I've been unable to find it, so I'm doing it here fresh. So anyway, I will ask a few questions as we go along, and just talk as if you're there. And I know, of course, I won't get an answer, but I would like for you to be thinking about some of these things, and I'll definitely bring them back up when we meet Monday in class face to face. So the first thing, hopefully you finished Unit 1. We didn't in class get a chance to talk about uh, the Mesopotamians really at all, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Standard of Ur, all of those things that you'll be tested on. Nor did we really have time to talk about the Egyptians, so I went through that in another video that you would have found in Lesson 1 that I emailed everybody about. So hopefully you'll go through that, and that'll give you some of the background for this, because we will contrast the Greek world a little bit with the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians, and especially with the Romans when we get to the Romans. So, whether you know it or not, the Greek world has had a tremendous influence on the Western culture and Western Hemisphere. Most everyone that's grown up either in the Western world or grown up with sort of a Western-based education will have been introduced to some aspects of the Greeks one way or the other. So we'll go through a little bit of their history, talk about some of the specifics for this class, and hopefully connect them to some of the things that you've seen before. So, all right, I'll try not to say so quite so much. Bronze Age culture. Remember in the first class we talked about, we had the Paleolithic Age or the Stone Age, we had the Neolithic, and then we had the Iron and the Bronze Age. So this sort of overlaps with the first metallurgical age, the Bronze Age, from 5000 to 2500 BC or 20 to, or BCE. And there were a lot of Bronze Age cultures of the Aegeans. We're not going to talk much about any of them, but the ones we are going to mention include the Cyclades, the Minoans, and the Mycenaeans. And I'll point a few things out on this map. This is, of course, modern-day Turkey, what was called Asia Minor, and modern-day Greece. Here's Italy over here. We're going to spend a lot of time back over this way later on, but for now we're going to focus on Greece. I'll point out some things because we won't really come back to this map later on. This is Crete. This is an important island for the Minoans and the Cyclades. We'll talk about that in a minute. This is Olympia, where Mount Olympus is, where the Olympics are famed to have started. I'm sorry, Mount Olympus is up here. Olympia is where the Olympics started. And then in the detail, which is of this area, you can see Athens, which you'd be somewhat familiar with, Marathon, Corinth, Sparta, and we'll talk about Sparta here in just a minute as well. So first off, the Minoans. The Minoans thrived from 1900 to 1375 BCE. Again, remember, that's a pretty long time ago. They settled the island of Crete, which is why I pointed that out just a second ago. And it's pretty well established that um, they established trade with much of the known world at the time, which included the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians, and even as far away as the Britons in the West. That's, of course, established through finding artifacts that would have only been made in those parts of the world, and then also finding Minoan artifacts in those parts of the world, suggesting that there was extensive trade. The name Minoans comes from their most famous king, who was King Minos of Knossos, which is a city, especially a palace, in Crete. And one of the probably most noteworthy and unusual things about the Minoans is their art and culture is very peaceful. If you remember from my little talk about the Egyptians and about the Mesopotamians, um, warfare is more the rule than the exception during this time period. I guess you'd say that is true in our time period as well, really. Um, so it's probably always been true. And every once in a while, you'll have a culture that lasts a very long time, 1900, 1375. I mean, that's 525 years. Remember, how long has the United States been in existence? We signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776. It's now the year 2016, right? So not very long at all compared to 525 years. So keep in mind all the things that have happened in our world in the last 200 years, last 100 years. And remember that the Minoans spanned 525 years, and during that entire time, they were almost exclusively peaceful. They were happy on their island of Crete. Crete, because it's an island, gave them a certain degree of protection from other people. And they had no interest in necessarily spreading out and taking over other lands and being imperialistic, as most people do. So art and culture is very peaceful. This work of art, called bull leaping, is it can also be called Toreador fresco. This is a Minoan work of art. Notice things about it that may be new that we haven't really encountered so far, such as it is a fresco. A fresco is a specific type of painting. And we'll talk a little bit more, I think. Let me look real quick. Yeah, there it is. A fresco. You can't see it on the slide. I'm sorry. I'm going to shrink this down a minute so you can read it. I apologize. A fresco is a painting done rapidly in watercolor on wet plaster on a wall or ceiling so that the color penetrates the plaster and becomes fixed as it dries. So I just read that straight from here. You can write that down. Frescoes are really important to the history of art. So we're gonna encounter multiple frescoes throughout the time periods we talk about, and this is the first one. They were a very durable type of art, but they also had their unique challenges. So if you don't know what plaster is, try to picture paper mache or plaster of Paris. Plaster was a common finish that was put on old houses even 50 years ago. Now they use sheetrock mud. But it's basically a compound that is thick, kind of the thickness of peanut butter, and you spread it on the walls, and then it dries. Well, before it dries, in order to paint a fresco, you have to paint it. You have to do all your painting before the fresco dry or before the plaster dries, and so that tended to present a few challenges because it meant things had to be done fairly quickly. So then we'll encounter several different solutions to that. But obviously, and you can even see this in the rim, this painting or this fresco is obviously sort of decaying. But usually, to accomplish having enough time, they would do little sections at one time and then add to those sections, etc. So. This fresco was done sometime between 1450 and 1375 BCE. Notice it's not especially tall, only 2.5 feet or 2 feet and 1/2 inch, so basically 2 feet tall. What's going on in this fresco? There's everything. It's not much more, or not much. Well, I'm sorry. I'm not sure how I'm trying to say this. It's really not known. It's probably the conjectures and guesses as to what's going on are a little more firmly based in history than some of the cave painting stuff we looked at, of course, but not much more. Minoans clearly held the bull in very high esteem. Almost definitely there's something religious or some sort of rite of passage or something like that is going on. But beyond that, a lot of this is just speculation. So we won't spend a lot of time talking about that necessarily. This is another example of Minoan art, also a new medium for you, also showing bulls. This is a pastoral scene where basically, the man is working with the bulls. This is entitled the Vaphio Cup. It was discovered in Sparta. Now remember, the Minoans come from Crete, but this particular work of art was discovered in Sparta. It's clearly, however, art historians know this, is clearly from the Minoans, and it is gold rapuza. And rapuza is a specific technique used that involves hammering shapes from into metal, but doing it from the inside out. So basically, this cup was made by using a lot of hammers and tools to meticulously hammer out the details that you see in the cup. And this is just a drawing of what the entire cup looks like. So here's the detail part that we were kind of looking at. But the scene wraps all the way around the cup, and like I said, it is gold. So gold rapuza is the name of the medium for the Vaphio cup. And like I said, rapuza is a technique where the artist hammers out the design from the inside, and the medium, again, is gold. Now, very unlike the Minoans, we encountered the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans were on the Greek mainland, directly south of Sparta. In fact, the Spartans are direct descendants of the Mycenaeans, or at least they like to consider themselves direct descendants of the Mycenaeans. Most of you have probably heard of Sparta or the Spartans, and you probably know that Spartans are most well known for their embracing of the techniques of war and fighting, and being really well known as warriors. They get this directly from the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans culture was built on war, and in fact, they are the ones who brought the Minoans more or less to a complete end. Eventually, they decided they wanted the island of Crete, and they went over and took it, and the Minoans really couldn't do anything about it. The Mycenaeans also are known for works of art, but notice these works of art, it's a work of architecture primarily, and its purpose was basically to protect their kingdom from other invading armies upon whom they've been waging war. So the basis of their art is also war. The Lion Gate is very large, and I'll show you. Let's see if I can get this detail. Here's a drawing of the Lion's Gate when it's not fallen apart, so you can kind of get a sense of the scale, right? These are human beings, and so notice in particular the size of the stones. So this type of masonry actually has a very specific name. It's called Cyclopean masonry. The walls were 20 feet thick and 50 feet high. So these walls are 50 feet high, and they're made up of huge hunks of quarried stone, which means that the stone is cut uh, out of bigger rock, typically, so that it's in a more or less regular shape, but it's really, really large. So it's very different from bricks. Remember the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians. The Mesopotamians built their ziggurats, and the Egyptians built their pyramids out of bricks. And bricks are basically mud and water and straw that's fired. So it's not true stone. And if you've ever been around brick, especially after the fired face of it starts to wear off, you know that brick is actually quite soft. You can hit it with a hammer and it'll break apart. This, in contrast, is stone. You hit it, it's not going to break, not very easily. So quite different from one another. And then the Lion's Gate detail, the lions themselves, is carved limestone. So the medium's limestone. This is a detail of what the lions probably looked like with their heads, but the heads are now missing. So it's just sort of a conjecture. So that's the Mycenaeans. Like I said, they directly fed into the Spartans. And then just north of the Spartans is where we have Athens. Again, we've heard a lot about. You've probably heard a lot about Athens in your high school career or in other classes that you've had in college. And one of the hallmarks of Greek culture is called the Iliad and the Odyssey. These are two books written by Homer. Hopefully you've been forced to read some part of them. If you haven't, you probably know parts of the story. But the Iliad, we'll talk about what that is about, and also the Odyssey a little bit. But roughly, it's usually considered 800 BC is when you first get the writing down of the Iliad and the Odyssey and other parts of Greek history. The oral history had already existed. And by the 6th century BC, the Iliad and the Odyssey was recited in Athens out loud, sort of as a performance every 4 years. As you'll see, this sort of roughly correlated with the Olympics. They like to do everything. They like to do things every 4 years. And so the Iliad and the Odyssey is both history and myth. For us, history is about facts, about things that happened, that can be documented, that can be justified, that other people can look at and say, yes, this definitely happened on this date, in this way, more or less. For the Greeks and for much of ancient culture, history and mythology were not really all that distinct. So for us, mythology is something that people just make up, right? It's just a bunch of fanciful stories. Maybe their purpose is to explain something. Maybe their purpose is to just entertain people. Um, Rarely do we even think of the word mythology and think of taking something seriously at the same time. We just consider it to be silly. For the ancient Greeks, for the Egyptians, for the Mesopotamians, for the Romans, for the Mycenaeans, for pretty much everyone, um, that line didn't exist between history and mythology. So in the Iliad, when King Agamemnon of Mycenae, notice Mycenae, set sail to bring Helen back from Troy, um, and they ask for the gods to help them, and the gods actually accompany them and help the Greeks fight, and they help the Trojans fight. And some of the gods are for the Trojans, and some of the gods are for the Greeks. Um, we can with all certainty believe that Greeks believed those things occurred in that way, and at the same time that they didn't, if that makes sense. So they didn't necessarily literally think that Athena was fighting at the side of King Agamemnon, but they also did believe that Athena was fighting at the same side of King Agamemnon. So there's a suspension of scientific verification. It's just not necessary for them, which in many ways makes sense when we read fiction or think of stories that we love. They have a reality of their own. Um, it's not the same reality as, you know, two atoms of hydrogen and one atom of oxygen make water. And it's certainly not the same unreality of a bedtime story, but there is some sort of reality. So, anyway, I'm digressing. Um, the Iliad is basically about the Trojan War. For years, historians believed that it was just a story made up. Later, about 150 years ago, Troy was finally discovered. They realized that some of the things described in the Iliad were matching up with what they were discovering archaeologically about Troy, and realized that the story was probably mostly true. And by true, I mean historically verifiable. So the Iliad is the one that many high school teachers skip over for some reason in preference of the Odyssey. The Odyssey is probably my least favorite of the two, but the Odyssey is about the long return of Odysseus back to his wife Penelope after the Trojan War. When we get to Rome, we'll talk about how one of the origin stories for Rome and then eventually the Roman Empire actually also cycles back around to the Trojan War. Um, so the Trojan War, extremely important historically for the origin of the Greeks and Greek culture and the Romans and Roman culture. And as a result, for us in our culture, at least the Western culture, very, very much so. About 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago. No, yeah, I guess about 15 years ago. There was a remake of a movie. I'm sorry, there was a remake of the story of the Odyssey, and it was a movie. I'm curious if anybody knows what that movie happens to be. So if you know, let me know in class. This is a work of art, a piece of pottery. The Greeks were very fond of pottery. Um, you probably will see a few of these if you go on the museum trips, especially to Emory. Um, but this particular kind of pottery is called an amphora. And this is actually even more specific. It's called a Botkin class amphora. So it's Greek culture. The black figure ceramic is significant because it's distinct from several of the other kinds of amphoras. We won't spend a ton of time talking about them, but notice the warriors and kind of what they're doing. Obviously, this illustrates sort of a significant thing for the Greeks, especially the Spartans. An amphora is a specific type of pottery. It's a Greek ceramic jar with an egg-shaped body and two curved handles. So anytime you see something that looks kind of like this, you know it, you can call it comfortably an amphora. And this particular Botkin class amphora focuses on what we call arete, which I think is a term you have on your study guide that you need to know. And arete for the Greeks just meant virtue, or being the best that you can be. So this is probably not what most of you think of when you think of virtue. We think of virtue as kind of being good or not being bad. That's really a very simplified version of the word virtue, as the meaning of the word is sort of eroded over time. Originally, it definitely carried more the connotations of this arete, or striving to be the best you could be at whatever you end up doing. So in Unit 1, I spent a little bit of time talking about the polytheism of the Mesopotamian gods and the polytheism of the Egyptian gods, and I even briefly referenced the monotheism of the Jewish God, Yahweh. And that's going to become really important when we start talking about the transition from Rome to the Holy Roman Empire. But we'll definitely talk more about this in class on Monday, and really in subsequent classes as we move forward. Most of you have heard of the Greek gods and goddesses. You know there's quite a few of them. They are immortal, which means that they do not die, usually. There's a few exceptions. And probably one of the most interesting things about the Greek gods and goddesses is that they are capricious. They're immoral. They're unpredictable. So in monotheistic culture, that is, in the culture of Judaism, Islam, Christianity, which many of us have been raised in, the idea of thinking of a god as being immoral is very odd and strange. But in fact, it was pretty commonplace for the Greeks, as it was for the Egyptians, as it was for the Mesopotamians. If you read any of the excerpts about the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, you'll notice some distinct immoral behavior. I don't think there's anything from Egyptian mythology in the textbook, but if you've ever encountered that, you would have a similar thing. And really, in many ways, we tend to think of the Greek gods and goddesses as more superhuman than God, as most of us think of God, at least, as most people kind of conceive of God with a capital G. If any of you saw or read any of the Percy Jackson stuff, I mean, he did a book series on the Greek gods and goddesses. I think he did a book series on the Egyptian gods and goddesses, and now he's actually doing one on the Norse gods and goddesses. So, but the Greek gods and goddesses, when at least 2 or 3 movies were made, and it's really clear that, you know, the children of Athena and Poseidon and all these other guys, they're more like superheroes, right? So that is very much how we tend to think about the Greeks, the Greek gods and goddesses. The thing I need you to try and hold in your head, even though it culturally doesn't make much sense for most of us, is that despite the fact that the Greek gods and goddesses were capricious and immoral and unpredictable, the Greeks still felt like they were worthy of worship and serious devotion. And they spent a great deal of their literature and their art, their sculpture, their architecture, um, their pottery, revering the gods and goddesses, specific ones usually, of course. So um, they were very serious about worshiping Athena, for example. So in the next slide, which we'll probably start with when we get together Monday, is on the Parthenon. The Parthenon was the most extraordinary work of architecture of all time when it was built in the 400 BCE. Um, and it was built to be a temple to Athena. So even though Athena could get really upset because some human woman could weave better than her, uh, which seems really odd to us to think of when we think of a god or a goddess, um, she was still considered worthy of worship. So I'll leave you with that to think about. And I apologize if you fell asleep. And I will see you on